How's it going, y'all? This one should be a pretty quick one today. So obviously by now many of you will have seen the Circana data that was made public by Matt Piscatella a couple days ago. I've been periodically going through the data just because it has a lot in there, and I mean, I'm not exactly doing this as a full-time job, it's more for fun and I don't have unlimited hours in the day, so we're getting multiple videos about it. In case you haven't seen it, this is what the list of the top 20 software sales that were made in the most recent month. Now, bear in mind that numbers in here do not include Mario Kart World. I mean, technically they include the physical version of Mario Kart World that was sold, but not if it was bundled, hence why it's not mentioned on this list. Outside of that, the best-selling Nintendo game of the past month was Donkey Kong Bonanza, sitting in at number 7. Now, you might also be like, well, hang on a second, NBA 2K26, Madden NFL 26, those are the top 2 games. They were also released on the Nintendo Switch 2 this year. Maybe, like they were also really good selling games on the Nintendo Switch 2. Something that some might call delusional, others might call a very optimistic outlook. Thankfully, Matt also breaks down the content per console. Looking at the Xbox and the PlayStation chart, it's almost identical. NBA in first, Madden in second, Mafia and Metal Gear just right behind them. The usual generic games that everybody buys but nobody really talks about online because we are all very passionate gamers and everybody else just buys the best-selling games every year. Now you'll notice that once you pull up the Nintendo charts, you don't exactly see the same patterns. Outside of Madden and Minecraft and maybe Hogwarts Legacy, which made it into the top 20, it very much looks like a whole other chart. So immediately you realize that with NBA 2K26 on there, not even making the top 10 list, and seeing as how that was like the top selling game in all of the United States throughout that month, you can probably take away that not that many people decided to buy NBA 2K26 on their Nintendo console. But you'll also notice that that's not the case for Madden. Madden sits comfortably in second place, just behind DK Bonanza. You also might notice that the third place game, Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar, on the full top 20 list across all platforms was in 19th place. So obviously that means that the amount of copies sold by Madden, specifically in the Nintendo sphere, and a lower limit of whatever Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar sold. Now again, an optimist might think to themselves that Madden on the Switch 2 might have outsold the EA Sports MVP bundle across all platforms? Probably not. EA Sports Kickoff bundle? Again, I doubt it. But the question is exactly where would it land across all of these games that are pretty high sellers even though they've been out for a while. Now keep in mind that Nintendo does not include digital data sales, but in the case of this chart, only Bonanza's numbers are not included in this list. Well, and Minecraft's digital numbers as well. But Madden is not marked off. Madden digital sales are included because Electronic Arts gets to report that, not Nintendo. So right now, with the assumption with Nintendo consoles, the digital to physical ratio is like 70 to 75% or whatever. So we can assume that Bonanza sitting here in 7th place is like roughly 70% of the sales of that game. And still, Madden sits beneath it. But again, how far below it? Well, today in a Q&A from Matt Piscatella himself, we find out that Bonanza actually has a 50% attachment rate. And this includes both physical and digital sales of the Nintendo Switch 2, which obviously is a very good attachment rate, a seemingly much higher attachment rate here in the West versus Japan, but obviously nowhere near the attachment rates that we saw with Zelda and Mario Odyssey early on in their lives. But at the very least, maybe we have something to work with here. If you work with that attachment rate by the end of July, that's when the launch month of Donkey Kong was. Realistically, that's when they sold the most units. And then in August, another 300,000 Switch 2s were sold, so maybe half of those people decide to buy Bonanza as well, which means you'd be looking at roughly 150,000 copies of Bonanza. For error purposes, we can multiply it and say 200,000 copies of Bonanza were sold. And even then, this chart specifically is only looking at digital sales, so it might be less than that, it might be a little bit more than that, but the point is we have like a general ballpark. That would be like roughly the upper limit, I would say. And then over on the lower limit, if you look up the Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar, you find out that it released on August 27th. You also find out that 30 days after launch, it hit 500,000 units sold, and that's worldwide. And not only is it worldwide, it's also across PC users as well. So obviously we don't know exactly what they sold specifically in the United States, and even more so how many were sold on the PC versus the Nintendo consoles. But I think it's pretty fair to say that that's a fairly low number. I mean, strictly looking at the Famitsu data from Japan alone, that takes away like 110,000 of it just for the physical sales that were made over there. And that's like over the span of the whole month. We're looking strictly at what was sold in the United States on a Nintendo console in those first 4 days from when the game launched. So basically, you can probably say that Donkey Kong Bonanza sold very well, and Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar did about, as well as it should. Nothing crazy out of the ordinary. It sits at number 19 in the top 20 list for month of August. It looks good for a new game that just popped topped out. But it's not going to compete with the big boys. Now, again, to reiterate, the top 20 list includes the sales off of everything. So the Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar that sits here would only be the ones that are actually on Nintendo platforms. So the Story of Seasons that sits on the Nintendo list is actually slightly smaller. I think there's a big Switch user base for this game, but it loses a small percentage just to the PC users. So like I said, you're left with a fairly high upper limit of Donkey Kong Bonanza and a pretty low lower limit of Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar. Now, once again, the optimist might think to themselves that Madden probably sits closer to Donkey Kong Bonanza. After all, Madden was like the second best selling game this month. But in that same question about Bonanza that Matt Piscatella was asked, he highlights that the story of the Switch 2 software sales has really been whirled. Obviously, this is primarily thanks to the bundles, so you're getting that game whether you like it or not. Attachment rate of what, something like 80-ish%. And then a step downwards would take you to Bonanza, an attachment rate of roughly 50%. And then another step down to everything else. So that kind of tells us that Madden is a lot closer to the low numbers of Story of Season, low numbers in comparison to Bonanza, of course, rather than the fairly respectable numbers of Bonanza. And honestly, you can probably scratch off all of my previous mental gymnastics and mathematics that I just went to, and just take the answer of what he said at face value. Because quite frankly, this should really be a surprise to nobody. I mean, even if you look at the charts that were made by Video Game Insights, they reported that Madden NFL 26 scores big with 1.4 million units sold in the first 24 hours. The vast majority of sales came from consoles, with PlayStation and Xbox accounting for nearly all of that volume. And the neat thing is, when they show you the little chart, it shows the PlayStation, the Xbox, and Steam. They don't even really put Nintendo on this thing. And I don't know if it's because Nintendo is irrelevant in the discussion or because they don't report it, but the idea here is there's a lot of different hints that are pointing towards Madden not really doing all that well, where it's like enough to talk about. And this is kind of in line to the different headlines that have popped up over the past few months with third parties worrying about the sales that they've had on the Switch. And the discussion that I've been having over and over again on this channel is that, like, let's be real, you buy a Nintendo console for first party games. And really the only other thing trying to highlight that maybe third party titles will do well on a Nintendo console is basically the fact that Nintendo has not released first party games for the Switch 2. Or for the Switch 1 for that matter. They waited until October 2nd, which is after the end of the quarterly financials, which finish in September, because they really want the ratios to make it look more like third-party games and third-party developers are going to be more involved on this console, right? Because they want that passive income. I've kind of talked about this already. I mean, think about it this way. Going back to the chart, 1.4 million copies of Madden were sold. The majority of them, according to this, in the first 24 hours were on Xbox. That's a lot of money going towards a console that we all deem as dead, right? The push towards digital and the push towards third-party sales is very intentional, specifically at the start of the Switch 2's life, because it's money that goes to Nintendo that they do not have to put any upfront cost towards. And these games are the ones that sell the most in the United States. Now, obviously, NBA doesn't chart at all on the Nintendo console, and that's despite the fact that it was the best-selling game in the month. So clearly there's a little bit of a negligence there. This could be in part because NBA games were already on the original Switch and people saw that 2K was neglecting the quality that was needed on the original Switch. Or in my opinion, people got fooled into buying Madden because it was the first sports game to come on the Switch 2 and they all realized that the performance was bad, specifically the 30 FPS nature of that performance. And so a lot of that crowd that would have probably jumped from Madden and then also bought NBA 2K called it quits. And these type of percentages also hold up elsewhere. Recent data from the United Kingdom shows us that of all the people that decided to buy EAFC, the best-selling franchise in England, only 4% of that went towards the Switch 2. The numbers are low, and pretty much everything is showing that they are low except for eShop rankings. And what's worse is that these are the best of the bunch, right? Like Madden outsold every other third-party game on the console this month, specifically the month of August. So you have what? For every 100 people that bought a Switch 2, 80 of them, whether they like it or not, had to get Mario Kart, so obviously that has a very good attachment rate. Half of them bought Donkey Kong Bonanza, many of those because Nintendo didn't release anything else, so they're like, might as well. It has no competition, it's a first-party title, it's set up for success, and that's the best it can do. And then like what? Out of those 100 people, 4 of them, 5 of them, maybe even 10 of them might have bought the most popular of the third-party games, and then even fewer show up for every other third-party title. The thing is, again, to retrace a lot of discussions I've been having for months, this is not news. This is not surprising to anybody. This is what we've seen regularly as Nintendo fans since the GameCube. This does not imply that nobody buys any third-party games on Nintendo consoles. The idea here is that third-party titles perform significantly better on PlayStation and on Xbox. And again, I've broken this down so many times before and I just really don't feel like doing it again, so you can watch any of my videos, just search Nintendo third-party sales. But there's always like a meme, right? There's like a discussion that goes on that people like to say it, and they're like, I buy Nintendo for first-party consoles and then I use my other consoles for everything else. It's a very common practice. Again, even this recent data shows that nearly half of the people that own a Nintendo console also own another device, whether that's a PC, an Xbox, or a PlayStation. So, you know, a lot of them are going to be like, well, yeah, I get my Nintendo games on my Nintendo device, and then I buy my third-party games on anything else because it runs better. And then you have the other half of people, they don't want to have a third-party device, they only like Nintendo. And you'd think that, like, they'd be like, oh, hey, you know, I only have a Switch, I'll buy Madden. But then you realize that Nintendo fans, a lot of them only want to play Nintendo games. That's what they grew up on. They've never tried anything else. So they might, like, you know, get a little frisky and pick up one or two third-party titles and then like 1,500 Switch 1 titles. We don't get data for this, but I'm convinced that the upgrade packs alone are probably generating more revenue than any of these third-party games, with maybe like one or two exceptions. But Kirby and the Forgotten Land, and especially Mario Party Jamboree's $20 upgrade pack, that's way more appealing to the masses, the Nintendo masses, than Madden. And it's a little naive to think otherwise. And I say naive, but really it's optimism, right? Like, I was there in your position. You know, I had a Wii U, then we got, what was it, the Arkham games, Call of Duty, there was a few other ones that popped up, and you're just like, yo, like, this might be it, and it's Nintendo console, like, the big boys are putting their games on here. And then quickly after that, it just dies out. Nobody buys it. And when nobody buys it, the devs put less effort into it, and then sometimes they stop putting them in there altogether. I remember getting FIFA when it first came to the Nintendo Switch. I went to my mom's house and one of my nephews was there, took out the Joy-Con, slid them out, and we just each played with half a Joy-Con, and I was like, yo, this is the future. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, there's not even like that big of a drop-off. Like, how much performance do you actually need for this game? Because remember, this thing was stronger than the PS3, it was weaker than the PS4. It sits roughly where the Switch 2 sits in today's market. If anything, it might even be more powerful compared to the market at the time as what the Switch 2 is. But I started to believe. And then you get like a few of these third parties every now and then that'll release a game on the console and it just like wows everybody. Like, how is Witcher 3 running on this thing? And then the sales just don't reflect it. And we're gonna see the same thing with Outlaws. All I'm saying is you might have a lot of optimism going into the Nintendo Switch 2 for like how the third parties are gonna look on there, but we've played this song and dance before. They put the games on there, they're not quite as good. Some Nintendo fans will try to pretend that they are quite as good, and then eventually they'll just pull away. They stop supporting it, or they give you like the most laziest ports and just a select few people buy it. Because the reality is that most people that want to play these games, while the handheld novelty is good, and it's not like there's no market for it, an overwhelming majority of these people want the best experience they can get playing FIFA, playing Madden, playing NBA, playing Call of Duty. Call of Duty's not on the Switch 2, but if it eventually comes, you get the idea. The versions of the games that you get on the Switch 2 are watered down. Star Wars Outlaws is watered down. Even the DLSS on the Switch 2 is watered down. I don't know if you guys have seen the recent digital Foundry videos, but it's like a bootleg version of DLSS, the kind that you would buy from AliExpress, the kind that only a mother could love. Just like all of these ports, the DLSS is also tailor-made for the Switch 2, but it is watered down. That's like the end-all and be-all. And the millions of people that buy these games every single year, they want the performance. They want the top-of-the-notch stuff. They've been spending the big bucks their entire life for that big performance, not to play it handheld. And what'll happen is people will argue that like the form factor makes it worth it even if you're getting a slightly inferior version. And like, how do I put this in words that Nintendo fans can understand? Okay, so like a few months ago, I think it was either right at launch, maybe right before launch, I made an argument that we could very much be living in a situation where if the Nintendo Switch 2 were to fail, one of Nintendo's solutions, instead of dropping the price, they could effectively just treat the Switch 2 like a Switch Pro, and they can basically backport their games from the Switch 2 to the Switch 1. Right? It wasn't like this is what Nintendo's going to do. It was just kind of like a hypothetical, you know, like these could be one of the ways where they solve the problem if there is a problem, if the Switch 2 fails, if, you know, it was just like a random thought. And it's funny because I've seen a lot of people bring up that point that I had made, as if like it's so absurd to assume that a Switch 2 game can run on the Switch 1. Now, obviously, we're only talking about first-party titles, right? So my takeaway from this whole idea that, like, it's so absurd for me to think that, is that Nintendo fans look at the idea of Mario Kart World being able to run on the Switch 1, or Donkey Kong Bonanza being able to run on the Switch 1 as something that's absurd, even though both of those games initially started development on the Switch 1. So my argument for this is that, if Nintendo really wanted to, and they wanted to get sales, they could water down these games. They could make inferior versions of them, whether it's for Mario Kart World knocking the players in half and then slowing down the performance, lowering the resolution. For DK Bonanza, just stripping away everything that makes it beautiful on the Switch 2 and making it a little bit more dull, but hey, you get the game on the Switch, right? Like, that doesn't seem that absurd. It's Nintendo. They built these games starting with these consoles. They should theoretically be able to water them down so that they work fairly well on those consoles, and it should be fine. But then when I say something like that, Nintendo fans, Switch 2 fans specifically, will look back at me and be like, but yeah, at that point, you're not even getting the same experience anymore if it's not Mario Kart World with the entire open world or with the 24 races, or if it's not DK Bonanza with like the visuals or performance or whatever. And I think it's weird because these are the same exact people that will turn around and with a straight face and be like, well, I don't see why Grand Theft Auto can't be released on the Switch 2 when it comes out. I don't see why any other major third-party developer has any excuse now to not put these games on the Switch 2. I don't see why people have to make such a big deal that these third-party titles are watered down, are slower, are uglier. The upper limit of the performance of the Switch 2 is the Series S, which is a budget console. I need to remind you, it's like the lowest of the low for the modern gen. But so many of these Switch 2 fans are like, oh, like, yeah, what's the big deal? The third-party games can make it run on this console. Why wouldn't you? So let me put it this way. The way that you look at me when I think that you can water down a Switch 2 title to get it running on the Switch 1 is the way the entirety of the industry looks at you when you assume that every single third-party game can run on the Switch 2, even with like minor sacrifices, who cares? This is delusion. It's the Nintendo delusion, and I know it because I had it for a very long time. And keep in mind, with the gap as big as it is right now, from the Switch 2 to the current gen stuff, and this console's supposed to last, what, another 8, 9, 10 years again? Just like the Switch 1 did? So in like 2 years from now, when like we get to the next step of the next generation of consoles, and they're making those even more taxing games, you expect them to put in effort to get them on the Switch 2? They didn't do that for the Switch 1. The Switch 1 got old ports. The Switch 2 is going to get old ports. If it gets new games, they're going to be very watered down. And the reality is most people that are going to be spending $70 for games, maybe even $80, at this rate, maybe $100, are not going to buy the inferior version for their Nintendo console. They're gonna play Mario on the Switch 2, and they're gonna play Call of Duty on whatever other device that runs it better than a potato. These first few months of the Nintendo Switch 2's life are the only time where third-party sales are going to look as high on these lists as any other month going forward for this console's life. And it's because Nintendo delayed the launch of everything in order to have that first quarter where it just looks like third-party games are doing well and they advertise the hell out of them. So you'd see like Amazon bestsellers list, you'd see Nintendo eShop rankings, you'd see everything, but obviously nothing has numbers next to it. You don't know how much they're selling. But then you can jump into like the Target website, or you jump into Walmart and you rank them by bestsellers, and you can see that like the Jamboree from the Switch 1 sold 1,000 copies, and that's about as much as Madden sold in the past 30 days. The best that a third party can do is compared to a last gen title, maybe, if it's the best of the third party games and it just came out. That's the reality. They're not going to do it because it's not going to be worth their time and their money. And right now it's going to look pretty, but it will die away very quickly. This is the exact same conversation we had a decade ago, 15 years ago. And Nintendo can try their damnedest to passively gain their income from Madden, from NBA, from FIFA, from Call of Duty. And they can really try to court Ubisoft and Capcom and beg them to like put all the greatest marketing they can in the first year or two for the Switch 2's life in hopes that maybe these games will like just do gangbusters on the Switch 2. But they won't, because even the most staunchest of Nintendo fans would prefer playing a third-party game with better performance. Actually, even the most staunchest of Nintendo fans would not even play those games. But the ones that would play it with better performance. Yeah, I said this was going to be short. I guess I went a little bit longer. Whatever the case is, I see people trying to push this narrative online that Madden NFL 26 was the best-selling game in the month of August, and obviously because the Switch 2 sold 2.4 million, it probably carried a lot of those numbers because these people are delulu. It's not. It has nothing to do with it. It just looks good on paper, and it might make a headline to maybe push somebody to be like, oh, hey, like Madden's on the Nintendo console now. They tried it before. It didn't work. It's not going to work again. But that's all I got for right now. Thank you so much for listening. I'll catch you guys on the next one.